Welcome to Hillsdale College's campus here in Washington, D.C. This is the Alan P. Kirby Center for Constitutional Studies and Citizenship. I am Matthew Spaulding. I run Hillsdale's operations back here in Washington, D.C. I'm also the dean of our soon-to-be-opening Graduate School of Government here in Washington, D.C., so you can watch for that. We have a great topic this evening and a great and dear friend speaking to us that I'm happy to have join us. Our topic is both timeless and timely, as it turns out. It's timely because how we understand ourselves, our history, and our continuing purpose is at the heart of what makes us a nation. How the American story is taught in our schools is crucial to how citizens are formed, and thus to the future of our country and its great story. Right now, our schools don't seem to be doing a good job at that. Indeed, many are quite hostile to the American story itself. This debate about America, its past, and whether we should be patriotic towards it, is now engaged in a public debate. Not that it hasn't been engaged before, but it seems to be a little bit more direct and partisan and intense, shall we say. America's past and public defense of it is the stuff, it turns out, of hatred and racism and white supremacy. Yet I don't hear much in that public debate that doesn't go back to the deeper problem of what the leading scholars and textbooks have been teaching our students. But the last thing we need, I think we all agree, is another history book. I'm sorry to say. But what we do need, and what we long needed, is a clear and compelling narrative of the great American story. An honest account that is also compelling and inspiring for students, but for us too. And I think we have one. Bill McClay is an American historian. He's an award-winning author and teacher. He's received his BA from St. John's College and his Ph.D. in history from Johns Hopkins. He currently serves as the G.T. and Libby Blankenship Chair in History of Liberty at the University of Oklahoma. He's held numerous positions around here and elsewhere at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. He was a senior fellow at the Trinity Forum and a senior fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center. He's the author of many books, including Why Place Matters, Geography, Identity, and Civic Life in the Modern America, A Student's Guide to U.S. History, and The Masterless, Self and Society in Modern America, which won the Curdy Award of the Organization of American Historians for the best book in American intellectual history. He has also recently penned a new introduction to an edition of Russell Kirk's Concise Guide to Conservatism. And now he has written Land of Hope, an invitation to the great American story, just published by our good friends at Encounter Books. And this fall, I'm happy to announce, Bill will be teaching an online course centered around the book for Hillsdale College. But it shouldn't prevent you from buying the book. Because as all students know, to do well in class, you need to buy the book. Please join me in welcoming good friend Bill McClay.
Thank you, Matt. And by the way, everything I know about George Washington, I know from Matt Spaulding. So you can take that for whatever it's worth. Well, it's wonderful to be here. And I have to say at the outset that I have a phalanx of my former students here in the front row who are going to be scrutinizing every word I say, and so I feel very much as if I better be on my game. Okay, this is a textbook that we're talking about here, and many people have asked me, why on earth did you do this? Why did you write a textbook? And it's of course, the assumption is that I'm going to make lots of money. We'll see about that. But given the fact that I'm going against the grain of a great deal of academic publishing, textbook publishing, pedagogical practice, and so on, that's not really my expectation. But I wanted to write a book that was directed at young people of all ages, and actually I've been astonished at how well the book has done in the trade market, because actually we've only begun trying to sell it to schools. So I hope that's a good augury. But I wrote it with young people in mind, with the kind of account that I would want for myself, for my children, for other people's children, not as the be-all and end-all, not as a comprehensive narrative. I didn't mean it as my version of the Aeneid for America or anything like that. It is more modestly, as the subtitle says, an invitation, and not something that's meant to be definitive or pretends to be definitive. But it is a story. It is an account of American history that is rendered in narrative form that tries, I'll read you some passages before this is all done to give you a feel for what I tried to do stylistically. Another reason why I did it is that Matt mentioned when he introduced me that I had written something called The Student's Guide to U.S. History, probably 15 years ago or so, for ISI Books. And it's part of a wonderful series that they do on the disciplines, student guides to various disciplines. And some of the people, Harvey Mansfield on political theory, I mean, you can't beat that. John Lukács, the late John Lukács, on history, historiography, and various others. And so they're really good. They did kind of, have to scrape down to get me for doing U.S. history, but it's actually been a pretty steady seller for them. And there was a period of time, which hardly a week went by, that I didn't get a message from somebody saying, "I love your student guide, but you don't recommend a textbook. Why is that?" And, getting 50, 100 of these over a period of time, I began to think, maybe they have a point. And I always wrote back the same thing. I didn't recommend a textbook because I didn't think there was one I could recommend. I said I kind of like Paul Johnson's book, History of the American People, but it has some problems and some asymmetries, and it isn't the be-all and end-all either. So I had this thought in the back of my mind that at some point you need to stop complaining and do something and contribute something. I've written a lot of articles complaining about the absence of synthesis in American historiography, the fragmentation of the field, and at some point you just have to put up or shut up and try to do something more integrative, more synthetic, more holistic, to bring some kind of order out of the chaos. So all of these things were in the back of my mind when Roger Kimball approached me about this. This wasn't something I initiated entirely on my own. It's something I'd been thinking about, and Roger Kimball, who's the publisher of Encounter Books, approached me about it. And he managed to catch me at a weak moment. It was a Sunday afternoon. Roger does business on Sunday. He's the only person I know who does that. He called me on the phone, and I was in a very mellow mood. I was feeling very Sabbath-oriented and kind of kindly disposed to the entire human race, and satisfied with myself. After repenting a whole lot earlier in the day. And he said, he talked me into it. I agreed. I hung up the phone, told my wife I agreed to do this. She said, "Are you out of your mind?" So I went on with it. And I started looking more seriously at the other textbooks that were out there. And I felt more and more strongly the need, and I'll talk about this more in a minute, but the need for something else, something different. Say a few words about the textbook world, and this is not definitive either, but it's basically dominated by the three big publishers, Pearson, McGraw-Hill, and Harcourt. And there are others, obviously, but the lion's share of the market is dominated by them. And that chilling dominance is likely to continue. There's also, I think, a great deal of influence, sway over the teaching of history exerted by authors like Howard Zinn, whose People's History of the United States has sold, I think, over 2 million copies, and is, I think, to be fair, and I quote Michael Kazin, the historian of American social movements, a man of the left, that Kazin's account of American history is a comic book. It's a sort of a reductive, simplistic version of American history in which the good guys all wear white hats and are generally oppressed, and the bad guys wear black hats and generally hold positions of authority. Not the most full and complete guide to American history. So, but Howard Zinn tells a good story. I think any of you who've ever read Zinn, he's actually a very good writer. And sometimes writing fairy tales can be more rewarding in terms of the prose than trying to render a complicated, morally tangled account, which is what our history is. Anyway, what I wanted to mention, and this just came up, this is breaking news. Yesterday I read in one of the education online publications, Inside Higher Education, that Pearson has decided to go all digital with their textbooks, 1,500 titles, which presumably will include their history titles. And they will be, completely, they won't be, you can get the print edition on demand, but clearly that over time will fade out because of the expense and because of the fact the digital version will be updated constantly. And so students will be required and institutions will be required to offer the latest and greatest version of these constantly updated texts. So, and Pearson's actually been fairly honest about what they're trying to do. They're really trying to drive the secondary book market out of business, eBay and various others, resellers of books, and even the rental book market, which is very strong in higher education now. They say what they want to promote is a greater degree of interactivity with students, pedagogical progress. But I think it's very clear that in the long run, and the long run may not be too far off, institutions that adopt Pearson books will be required to restrict their students' access to only things that are on the Pearson platform. So the books will cease to be a factor. The words will be written on sort of the equivalent of digital sand, constantly subject to revision, and then revision after that, and then revision after that. It's a sort of Orwellian prospect. Back in the early years of printing, printers had a saying that they would often mount in their print shops, litera scripta manet, which means in Latin, the written word remains, which I think is actually a beautiful saying. But a civilization such as ours, which has been defined by books, we are, Christians and Jews are the people of the book. We now will be people of the screen. People who are tied to the ever-changing, ever-fluid presentation of the past and other subject areas, other discipline areas, by the nature of digital technology. So this is part of the environment into which Land of Hope comes. And I'm definitely swimming against the tide. Encounter is swimming against the tide, where we wanted to produce something of enduring value, something that has a quality of permanence about it. That, it's been a long time since I've heard anyone speak of textbooks being venerable. So that may be too much to shoot for. That'll be something that readers will decide whether they venerate it or not. But that's what we were shooting for. I want to say a few things about Encounter because a number of people I had people who were really surprised and amazed that I wanted to do this in the first place, and then when I told them that I wanted to do it, that I was doing it with Encounter, they were even mildly appalled and said, "What? They're not a textbook publisher. They're and there's all kinds of problems." And what I found was, in fact, this is not a proposition that one could confirm empirically, but I don't think I could have written the book any other way with any other publisher. Encounter did not subject me to the vetting of textbook committees in key states, Texas, California, the vetting of interest groups, of pressure groups, of stakeholders, as we like to call them. No, I was all by myself in my study writing this thing. I didn't have any research assistants. I basically didn't even talk to anybody. My students will confirm I never talked about this. I was doing this in secret, a little mole in the night. And I did it all by myself. I wrote every word. It reflects my outlook. Roger Kimball and the people at Encounter, I would say it actually bothered me at times that they didn't interfere at all. I'm so used to editors, kind of looking over my shoulder and saying, "Well, you don't want to say that," and or suggesting even more strongly that the perspective I'd taken is not quite what we want, and this might upset some people or whatever. Never once did they interject themselves, and they didn't. The editing process was fairly light. I wouldn't have minded it being a little more heavy-handed. There are places where I cringe a little bit now reading it, but on the whole, it was a very respectful edit. So this was something that didn't go through the meat grinder or the food processor that most textbooks go through, I'm very grateful to Roger Kimball and to his staff for giving me this freedom, and I think the book is better as a result of that. It does reflect, for better or worse, the perspective of an author rather than being something assembled in effect by committee, and by a rather disheveled committee at that. I'm actually convinced that many textbooks are not read by anyone. And I mean the people in the publishing houses don't read it. The authors, the big name historians who are on the cover, I don't think they've read the things that are being published in their name. I'm not sure who is reading them, but the biggest surprise I had in this whole process, and there's about 25 textbooks piled up in my study at home, was that the problem was less with ideological imbalance. There is that, especially when you get into the period after 1960 or so. But the real problem is that these books are unreadable. And it's no wonder to me that young people don't want to read them. I don't want to read them. It's a disgrace. These books often cost $150 or more, and they appear not to have been edited for reading comprehension, let alone fact checking. So I may be getting a little carried away here, but it really is very bad. And one of the things I was worried about, and some of my colleagues on the university level looked at chapters and said, well, this is all, you got everything right here, but, this reading level is way too high for high school students. Well, I also tested the same chapters out on my former students or our high school teachers, and they all said, oh, this is fine. This is much better than what we've been giving them, textbooks by X, Y, and Z. In some ways, we underestimate the capacity of our young people to read books if interesting books are put in front of them, if books that can grab them and compel them, that have a narrative thrust to them, that fire their imagination, that convey to them that history is not just an inert recitation of facts, but it's a moral enterprise. It's a task of reflection. It's a part of what it means to be human, to think about the past, to think about the stories of the past. Let me just talk a little bit about the book in terms of some of the emphases that I bring to it. And these are things that run through the book as a whole. I like to think, I always like to think in musical terms, that it's sort of like a rondo. It's a multiple rondo. There are several rondo themes, maybe about 5 of them, that keep popping up and recurring through the text. It's sort of a fugal rondo, if there is such a thing. And most of these themes are encompassed in the title itself, Land of Hope, an invitation to the great American story, which is the one element of the book where I did have a lot of wrestling with the publisher, because they publishers want certain words, certain phrases that are going to help them sell the book, and I fought them on that. I think I pretty much won. I got the title I wanted. So let me just break it down. First, it's a land of hope. Land. That's certainly an element in my outlook on American history. That America is not just an idea. America is a concrete entity, a nation that has a history, a very particular history, and that if we're to understand it, it's not enough to sort of understand certain principles, as important as that is. We have to understand how those principles became instantiated or not instantiated, as the case may be, how they're worked through and worked out, how they're developed, how they come to be dominant, at least we hope, in our national life, and maybe too dominant in some cases. So America's definitely about ideas, but America is not simply an idea. America is a land with a venerable history, with I think particularly of those who lie at Arlington National Cemetery and graveyards of those who've given their lives for the country, the history of sacrifices on behalf of the country. These are things that bind us to it in ways that go beyond questions of ideas or principles. They're particularities and not abstractions. That's maybe another way to put it. So, second, hope, land of hope. Several people said, why is it not land of hope and glory? The Anglophile types. And then people say, there's going to be a lot about Obama in this book. And there's actually very little about things after 1992, which I will explain in a minute. But part of what I meant to do by emphasizing hope is, and it's complicated, and I think you see the working out of the complexity over the course of the book, is that fundamentally hope it's a spiritual attribute. It's an attribute. It's a quality of soul. something that's not explicable in strictly material terms. But it is a characteristic of the country that we seek to rise above or transcend or move beyond that which is given, our given state in life is not the final word about it. And so that we have that sort of striving aspect, which I argue goes back to the very beginnings. In fact, this is a little bit fanciful, but then in the first chapter I even talk about the fact that the Western Hemisphere, so far as we know, has no truly native peoples in it. That so far as we know, 20, 30, 40,000 years ago, the first migrants to the Western Hemisphere came over the Bering Strait and sort of filtered down to people the continent. And then we have from the other direction, the Ericsons and other explorers coming from Europe, and that there's a long tradition in European myth, if you will, literature, of a mystic land in the East, a place of renewal, the Elysian Fields, Atlantis, so on. It's a very well-established trope within European thought, in anticipation of America before the fact. There, too, you have a notion of hope. Hope is the prospect of redemption, the prospect of starting the world over again, of starting life over again, a new Zion, an errand into the wilderness, the language of New England Puritanism. So I think all of this, and then that becomes transmogrified into more secular understandings of hope, but still, it's an elemental part of the makeup of the soul of America. Story, invitation to the great American story. And that emphasis on story is something that I insist on right from the start, that narratives are an essential part of the way that we human beings make sense of the world. We live our lives suspended in narratives, often that we don't completely understand, these webs of signification that uphold us, that define the way we see the world, the way we aspire in the world. And in fact, let me read to you. I'm going to read some more things, but I have a little discussion of this right early on in the book. So this is the right moment to read it. The impulse to write, this is on page XI, for those of you who have the book, the first page of the introduction. Yeah. It's 11 for you landlubbers, yes. About 4 or 5 lines up from the bottom. The impulse to write history and organize our world around stories is intrinsic to us as human beings. We are, at our core, remembering and story-making creatures. And stories are one of the chief ways we find meaning in the flow of events. What we call history and literature are merely the refinement and intensification of that basic human impulse, that need. And then I go on to say, the word need is not an exaggeration. For the human animal, meaning is not a luxury, it is a necessity. Without it, we perish. Historical consciousness is to civilized society what memory is to individual identity. That's a phrase worth pausing over, but without memory, without the stories by which our memories are carried forward, we cannot say who or what we are. Without them, our life and thought dissolve into a meaningless, unrelated rush of events. Without them, we cannot do the most human of things. We cannot learn, use language, pass on knowledge, raise children, establish rules of conduct, engage in science, or dwell harmoniously in society. Without them, we cannot govern ourselves. Nor can we have a sense of the future as a time we know will come because we remember that other tomorrows have come and gone. This next sentence, I think, applies to some of what I see around me today. A culture without memory will necessarily be barbarous and easily tyrannized, even if it's technologically advanced. The incessant waves of daily events will occupy all our attention and defeat our efforts to connect past, present, and future, thereby diverting us from an understanding of the human things that unfold in time, including the path of our own lives. Forgive me, I just one little bit more here. The stakes were beautifully expressed in the words of the great Jewish writer Isaac Bashevis Singer. When a day passes, it is no longer there. What remains of it? Nothing more than a story. If stories weren't told or books weren't written, man would live like the beasts, only for the day. The whole world, all human life, is one long story. Oh, I can't stop there. Singer was right. Singer was right. As individuals, as communities, as countries, we are nothing more than flotsam and jetsam without the stories in which we find our lives' meaning. They are stories of which we are already a part, whether we know it or not. They're the basis of our common life, the webs of meaning in which our shared identities are suspended. Okay, there, I'll stop. So I'm very interested in this book in sort of cultivating story, the reflective attitude towards the past mediated through story, and story is a way that we remember, that we stay in touch with the past, that the past becomes present to us, and the present becomes informed by the past. And there are stories, of course. André Malraux, the great French writer and resistance figure, somewhere, I've never been able to find where he said this, but somewhere he says, "What is a man? A miserable pile of secrets." And well, that's one way of thinking about a biography, right? And there are biographies and biographers out there who seem to swear by that understanding, that a person is, what a person really is what he or she hides, what they don't disclose, what they attempt to pass off in another way. But I think that there's another way to think about biography. There's another way to think about history. And instead of thinking of it in this negative way, as a compilation of secrets, of things that are missing. And that is to give, I think, credence to the mythic dimension, to the aspirational dimension of history. And that's one of the things I try to do in the book without blinking the fact that we've often done terrible things, that we have not been a land of hope for everyone. And that hope is, as I repeatedly say in the book, a double-edged quality, because to be a land of hope is also to be a land of disappointment, a land of frustration, a land of disillusionment even. And we experience all these things. We wouldn't experience them if we weren't a land of hope, if we didn't hew to that outlook, that doctrine. And finally, invitation. This is an invitation, the Great American Story. This is sort of a way of saying, communicating, I'm not pretending that this is the definitive American history that has every answer to every question. One of the things that was so frustrating about writing this is that I kept coming across things I couldn't go into without losing the narrative thread. You've got to throw things out. You've got to throw a lot out. And everybody who's read it said, I really like this, but why didn't you say something about X? And, all I can say is, I thought about that. It hurt when I had to leave that out. Does that satisfy you? At least I was in pain that I didn't. But it is. I think of it as triage and the lifeboat. You have to throw, your second best friend out in order to keep the thing from sinking. So you have to make very hard judgments. But it's also an invitation in the sense that I do want it to lead. I wanted to catch people's interest. I want young people, particularly, and all of you are young people, to want to go further, to want to supersede what I've done here, and to make American history the fascinating thing that it intrinsically is, but that we, I think, have deprived it of that interest. Okay, there's several passages I wanted to read, and then we'll stop and I'll take questions. But partly I want to give you a sense of what I try to do with some familiar, maybe familiar, I hope familiar parts of American history. Before I do that, I want to read words that are not mine, but the epigraph page there, for those of you who have the book. It's there were two things that I knew I wanted to have in this book before I wrote anything else. One was the title, Land of Hope. The subtitle is what we fought over, but they let me have Land of Hope. And this epigraph by John Dos Passos, who was a great American novelist, a great American writer, man of the radical left in his youth, who sort of moved to the sensible right. Let me read this. It's from an essay called "The Use of the Past." It seems so relevant to me. This is, by the way, it was written in 1941, and there's a lot going on in 1941. But every generation rewrites the past. In easy times, history is more or less of an ornamental art. But in times of danger, we are driven to the written record by a pressing need to find answers to the riddles of today. We need to know what kind of firm ground other men belonging to generations before us have found to stand on. In spite of changing conditions of life, they were not very different from ourselves. Their thoughts were the grandfathers of our thoughts. I love that phrase. Their thoughts were the grandfathers of our thoughts. They managed to meet situations as difficult as those we have to face, to meet them sometimes lightheartedly, and in some measure to make their hopes prevail. We need to know how they did it. In times of change and danger, when there's a quicksand of fear under men's reasoning, a sense of continuity with generations gone before can stretch like a lifeline across the scary present and get us past that idiot delusion of the exceptional now that blocks good thinking. That is why in times like ours, when old institutions are caving in and being replaced by new institutions not necessarily in accord with most men's preconceived hopes, political thought has to look backwards as well as forwards. Isn't that marvelous? I mean, there's so much here, but one of the things I want to emphasize is idiot delusion of the exceptional now. This is one of the things I find in teaching. It's very hard to get younger people interested in the past because they think we're living in an unprecedented time. That in the times we live in are so unprecedented. The technologies that we carry around in our pockets are so transformative in their character that there's really no point in looking at what went on in the 17th century, the 19th century. That's all been superseded. And it's an ill-informed, it's a way of justifying not learning anything about the things you already don't know anything about. But it is, I think, a real conviction. And it's something that this endless sort of parade of sensation and of media images and so on, in which everything is always being succeeded by something else. Nothing is permanent. Nothing's enduring. That feeds that and reinforces that sense that we do live in an exceptional now, capital N, now, that blocks good thinking. I'm going to skip this one because here, a lot of times people are interested, how do I handle some of the really sticky, difficult questions, slavery, Native Americans, that sort of thing. And here's an example. This is the end of the chapter that deals with the Constitutional Convention. And This will give you a sense of the kind of reasoning I engage in. At the time of the Constitutional Convention, the institution of race-based slavery was deeply enmeshed in one segment of the national economy, despite all the ways its very existence seemed to stand in glaring contradiction to the national commitment to liberty, equality, and self-rule. There was real bite to the mocking question fired at Americans in 1775 by the British writer Samuel Johnson. How is it that we hear the loudest yelps for liberty among the drivers of Negroes? Close quote. It was an excellent question, particularly if one kept in mind how many of the prominent founders, including Thomas Jefferson and George Washington, were themselves owners of slaves. How, we wonder today, could such otherwise enlightened and exemplary individuals have been so blind to the fundamental humanity of those they confined? How could they have made their peace with practices so utterly contradictory to all they stood for? There is no easy answer to these questions, but surely a part of the answer is that each of us is born into a world that we did not make, and it is only with the greatest effort, and often at very great cost, that we're ever able to change that world for the better. Moral sensibilities are not static. They develop and deepen over time, and general moral progress is very slow. Part of the study of history involves a training of the imagination, learning to see historical actors as speaking and acting in their own times rather than ours, and learning to see even our heroes as an all-too-human mixture of admirable and unadmirable qualities. People like us who may, like us, be constrained by circumstances beyond their control. And then I conclude this chapter saying, let's see, the ambivalences regarding slavery built into the structure of the Constitution were almost certainly unavoidable in the short term in order to achieve an effective political union of the nation. What we need to understand is how the original compromise no longer became acceptable to increasing numbers of Americans, especially in one part of the Union, and why slavery, a ubiquitous institution in human history, came to be seen not merely as an unfortunate evil, but a sinful impediment to human progress, a stain upon an entire nation. We live today on the other side of a great transformation in moral sensibility, a transformation that was taking place but was not yet completed in the very years the United States was being formed. There's more, but thank you. Thank you. Two other things. This is a Lincoln, and I talk about the fact that Lincoln, of course, had to run for re-election in the middle of the Civil War, and for a very long time in 1864, he thought he was certain to lose. And I talk about the reasons for that. Let me just pick it up here. We forget or are unaware of the depth and breadth of Lincoln's unpopularity during his entire time in office. Few great leaders have been more comprehensively disdained or loathed or underestimated. A low Southern view of him, of course, was to be expected, but it was widely shared north of the Mason-Dixon line. As the Lincoln biographer David Donald put it, Lincoln's own associates thought him, quote, a simple Susan. Apologies to any Susans out there. Oh, the Susans I know are all complicated, but a simple Susan, a baboon, an aimless punster, a smutty joker. He was, in the view of the abolitionist Wendell Phillips, a huckster in politics, a first-rate, second-rate man. George McClellan openly disdained him as a well-meaning baboon, McClellan being his opponent in the 1864 election. And here's my comment on this. We need to remember this is generally how history happens. It is not like a Hollywood movie in which the background music swells and the crowd in the room applauds and leaps to its feet as the orator dispenses timeless words and the camera pans the room full of smiling faces. In real history, the background music does not swell, the trumpets do not sound, and the carping critics often seem louder than the applause. The leader or the soldier has to wonder whether he's acting in vain, whether the criticisms of others are in fact true, whether time will judge him harshly, whether his sacrifice will count for anything. Few great leaders have felt this burden more completely than Lincoln. And then finally, and I think this has something to say about our current attitude towards the past, at least in some parts of the population, those who want to kind of go out and do a Robespierre, cleansing us of all remnants of the past to which we find objectionable today in the era of ultimate truths. That was ironic. This is the end of the Civil War. On April 9th, 1865, after a last flurry of futile resistance, General Lee, Robert E. Lee, faced facts and arranged to meet Grant, Ulysses S. Grant, Union General-in-Chief, at a brick home in the village of Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, to surrender his army. He could not formally surrender the whole Confederacy, but the surrender of his army would trigger the surrender of all others, and so it represented the end of the Confederate cause. It was a poignant scene, dignified and restrained and sad, as when a terrible storm that has raged and blown has finally exhausted itself, leaving behind a strange and reverent calm, purged of all passion. The two men had known one another in the Mexican War and had not seen one another in nearly 20 years. Lee arrived first, wearing his elegant dress uniform, soon to be joined by Grant, clad in mud-spattered sack coat, his trousers tucked into his muddy boots. Grant often dressed like this. He was kind of a slob. They showed one another a deep and respectful courtesy, and Grant generously allowed Lee's officers to keep their sidearms and the men to keep their horses and take them home for the spring planting. None would be arrested or charged with treason. 4 days later, when Lee's army of 28,000 men marched in to surrender their arms and colors, General Joshua L. Chamberlain of Maine, a hero of Gettysburg, was present at the ceremony. He later wrote of his observations that day, reflecting on his soldierly respect for the men before him, each passing by and stacking his arms, men who only days before had been his mortal foes. And I quote from Chamberlain. Before us in proud humiliation stood the embodiment of manhood, men whom neither toils and sufferings, nor the fact of death, nor disaster, nor hopelessness could bend from their resolve, standing before us now, thin, worn, and famished, but erect, with eyes looking level into ours, waking memories that bound us together as no other bond. Was not such manhood to be welcomed back into a union so tested and assured? On our part, not a sound of trumpet more, nor roll of drum, nor cheer, nor word, nor whisper of vain glorying, nor motion of man standing again at the order, but an awed stillness rather, and breath holding, as if it were the passing of the dead. Now this is me. Such deep sympathies in a victory so heavily tinged with sadness and grief and death. This war was and remains to this day America's bloodiest conflict, having generated 1.5 million casualties on the two sides combined. And then I go on to talk about all of that. For decades to come, in every village and town in the land, one could see men bearing the scars and mutilations of lost limbs, a lingering reminder of the price they and others had paid. So I guess I kind of think that if Chamberlain's troops could find it in their heart to be that forgiving, that generous, we certainly ought to be towards people in the far distant past. Lincoln, I'll just tack on something Lincoln said on the last day before, the day of his assassination, April 11th. He had a cabinet meeting that morning, and he said these words: "I hope there will be no persecution, no bloody work after the war is over. Enough lives have been sacrificed. We must extinguish our resentment if we expect harmony and union. There has been too much of a desire on the part of some of our very good friends to be masters, to interfere with and dictate to those states, to treat the people not as fellow citizens. There's too little respect for their rights. I do not sympathize in those feelings." Close quote. Of course, if he had known that John Wilkes Booth was going to hammer him that night, he might have had a different view. But, of course, that event changed the complexion of everything. But it is interesting to see, to look back on these characters in the past and look back on the responses they had at the time. Something that you may pick up from these examples is I do use a lot of oratory. I do a careful analysis of important speeches, some that are familiar to you, like Lincoln's speeches, Washington's farewell address, but some that are probably not. Calvin Coolidge's wonderful speech on the 150th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. It's a fantastic speech. If you want me to, I'll read it to you, but I think I've read enough. And of course, the John Quincy Adams's similarly great speech about American foreign policy. All of these are things I give a lot of attention to. So I do point back in the direction of primary sources, but I excerpt the parts that I think are going to be of particular interest, and hope to guide the reader back towards looking at the whole thing. So I don't know that I have a lot more to say at this point, but I would love to have your questions. So why don't I stop there? And who's ready? Well, this gentleman had his hand up almost before my last words were out.
Please wait for the mic.
In the beginning of your talk, I think you identified a problem which I see, which is in the academic world soon to be, if it isn't digitized, it doesn't exist.
Yes.
No one is going to be back in the stacks of the college library looking for original work. They're only being at Google or somewhere else looking at things that happen to have been digitized. Your comment, please.
Oh yeah, no, I think that's true. It's very hard. I'm looking this direction away from my students here. It's very hard to get people in college writing research papers to actually go to the library. Although actually, it's not true of any of you, but it is generally true. I mean, there's a sort of sense that if it's not available on the web, then I don't really need to bother with it. Of course, you can. One wonderful thing is that you can access very easily now scholarly articles from some of the most obscure journals that you would formerly have to trudge down to the reading room or maybe go down in the basement and find the 1988 edition of Church History and flip through and find something, and then Xerox it and take it home with you. That was my graduate experience. I can't imagine how much time I wasted doing that sort of thing. Well, now you can just bing, bing, bing and have it. So that's wonderful in a way. But Chesterton somewhere has a saying that the effect that the problem with modern travel is it makes it easier and easier to go to places less and less worth going to. And I think that's a principle that applies more generally. In some ways, you're going to have to do the work of discernment and just sort of sheer labor too at some point. I agree with you though. And this is part of what I was getting at the beginning is that this digitization is a mixed bag, and there is this sort of revenge of the analog concept out there, and I don't really think there's a substitute for books, and even ebooks. I have to admit I dislike Kindle. I've tried to use it. I don't like it, but so I may have a prejudice there, but But there's something important that's lost when the author and publisher are not committed to the idea that the text is going to be permanent in character. Come what may. It may be overtaken, so be it. But and it feels like where you have sort of like cellular biology, where you have lots and lots of discoveries going on all the time. I can see the merit of having an online kind of reference source there. American history is not really changing in its broad outlines from day to day. It shouldn't be. So I think the notion of being committed in history and in literature to some kind of notion of the integrity of the word and the weight of the word. The difference between the experience of writing something at a typewriter, which you're young enough to remember that, right? And sitting in a word process, it's a very different thing. When I was just signing some books, and I get very nervous because I can't erase things if I misspell somebody's name. I pretty much have to use a different book. It's the same way with typing. If you get something wrong, you can get out the correct type and all that junk, but it's a mess. Whereas with word processors, everything disappears, and it's in a way you're less careful about getting it right the first time because it doesn't really matter if you get it right the first time. And you may have, Mr. Google or Bill Gates or some specter hovering over you, changing your words with autocorrect. So you don't even need to pay attention to spelling. This is not good. We pay a price for that convenience. Yes, sir. Yeah,
I noticed you're a graduate of St. John's College,
Yes.
known for their great books.
Yes.
Which great books influenced you or most memorable and why?
Wow.
And also, should that structure of learning be adapted more by other colleges and universities?
Well, that's a great question because I actually think I love St. John's and I both of my kids went there and I served on the board there, but I also think there are history, for one thing, is almost non-existent in the curriculum at St. John's, and so for me to go into history was a kind of a radical, like a conversion experience coming out of St. John's. So I still respect what they do, but there's something lost when you don't read books in a historical context. I'll give you an example. My favorite example is that I had no idea until I graduated from St. John's and started studying history a little bit that Thomas Hobbes wrote Leviathan in the middle of a civil war. You would think that would somebody who insisted on this kind of totalitarian sovereignty, if I may put it that way. He didn't just pull these ideas out of the blue. He was responding to circumstances, exigent circumstances, and I didn't get that at all when I just read Leviathan. So I wouldn't want to see it universally adopted. I also would like to see it continue to be what it is. I learned how to read carefully, to read closely from St. John's in a way I can't imagine having learned anywhere else. So it's like the Athens and Jerusalem problem. I sort of try to hold to both of these ideals at once, the St. John's close reading, textualism, but also the contextualism of history as a discipline. That's a great, interesting question. And I think it would be good for other schools to imitate St. John. We have a course at OU that is a sort of St. John's-y course, but it also has lectures, and the lecturers, I'm one of them, and there are two colleagues that help me with it, or I help them. I'm not sure, but the course was my idea, but we give a lot of historical background and biographical background. You know, I didn't answer you the first part of your question, which of the great books affected me the most. Plato and Aristotle, the Bible, but particularly Kierkegaard, Fear and Trembling. After I read Fear and Trembling, that changed my whole view of, at least of the Torah. Don Quixote, loved Don Quixote. Dostoevsky, everything by Dostoevsky. I didn't like Kant very much. Still don't. And Hegel. So I love some of the readings we did in science. We read Newton's Principia, which is actually quite interesting. We read Euclid. And we worked through all, 12 books, is it, of Euclid? 12, 13 books. And the math tutorial. The best thing I did at St. John's, though, it was learn Greek. And I think that I recommend that to every one of you, all you young people. If you haven't, start. Latin's okay, but Greek is better. Do we have any other? Yeah. Yes, sir. You in the back. You in the back. Okay.
Thank you very much for presenting your interesting book. And as you being an expert of the narrative of the American nation, I want to ask you a question now, because in the current politics, there's this narrative that the America steers now back towards this great times and the great values. There's the slogan of the current administration that we all know, go back to those great times. And now, since you really dive deep into what these great times enshrine, what would your evaluation be? Does America go back to those great times, or does it steer somewhere else, and this attractive label is put on something which is something completely different?
Well, I say it's a great story. I don't take a position on the is America great? Was it ever great? That's really, and I don't mean that to be as. I do think there are moments of greatness in American history. There are moments of shame in American history, but I think the story as a whole of this nation that sort of starts it starts life in this faraway place. I mean, it's a province of Europe, in which certain elements of European civilization are allowed to flourish in a way that they never could on native ground, so to speak. And I think the way that all of that occurs, the way it unfolds, it's a magnificent story, and it's not a story that's over yet. So. Yes. Thank you. You have words you wanted?
Thank you very much, Bill. As you were speaking, one thing I reminded me of that I was thinking about as you were making your presentation is that for those of you and my students here that know me and know how we teach, we like to talk about prudence, which is the central virtue, the cardinal virtue, and the central virtue of human activity in many ways. It's the first aspect, the first element of prudence is the requirement for memory. And you must have a true memory of the true past in order to decide how to proceed. So thank you for that.